With lesson 15. Dear God, thank you for bringing us together today. Thank you for all the blessings in our life. Let us hear this material and absorb this material. In Jesus Christ's name, amen. Lesson 15 is the moral monstrosity of Old Testament genocide. Is God a moral monster? Dawkins proposes this with characteristic flair in The God Delusion. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving, a control freak, vindictive, bloodthirsty, an ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. I think...
And that's why Craig started reading today. There's no way.
He says, I think may have put up a straw man, or rather a straw God. It is so exaggerated that we might simply dismiss it, but let's take it seriously. God gave Israel two gifts, the law and the land. Unfortunately, the land was occupied, and the law looks barbaric to us, but that's the problem. It all depends on how things look to us now. We have to think about the practical problems of the people then. For all aspects of ethics, it is worth asking, what would Jesus do? In him we see what God is like when human, and we know how to be human. We see him motivated by compassion and justice. He shows love and anger. He did miracles of healing because he felt gut-wrenching love for them. The gospel invented the word gut-wrenching, splanknizomai, just for Jesus. And we saw him angry. He verbally attacked the Pharisees and all hypocrites. And he made a whip to physically drive financial crooks out of the temple. We ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? Because often the Bible is silent. It doesn't tell us about evils like heroin or cybercrime or daytime TV. Because different times have different problems and different solutions. Different times provide different possible methods for stopping evils. Who'd have thought that we'd ever have to stop dictators from attacking their own people? So we need to put ourselves back into ancient Near Eastern times. The easiest way to get rich is to kill your neighbors and steal all they have. There are no facilities for prisoners of war, no prisons that could hold them. You could dig through even a stone wall before mortar was invented. And family revenge was the central motivating morality of the time. If someone killed one in your family, you were honor-bound to kill them. If you were a child, you'd need to grow up, but eventually you'd get revenge. The Sunday school version of the conquest of Canaan goes like this. The Israelites all escaped from Egypt one day in spring and went to Canaan. They spent 40 years in the desert because the older generation was scared. A new generation defeated Jericho, then swept through Canaan, killing everyone. They were following their law that told them to kill men, women, and children, and they even had to kill animals and devote or destroy everything of value. The reality was a little different, as we find in the Bible text and archaeology. They did destroy Jericho and kill everyone living there, but it was a military post. They destroyed Ai and Hazor, but not many others. Reference Joshua and archaeology. Lots of Canaanites continued living in Canaan. Reference the Bible and archaeology. If they were told to kill everyone, why were they also told not to marry them? Deuteronomy 7, 2-4. When the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them, and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. How do we reconcile this? How do you wipe them out and then marry them? The answer is in verse 2. When the Lord gives them over to you to defeat them, those who attacked the Israelites were to be killed, those who didn't live among them. Who attacked them? In the Sunday school version, everyone did, but according to the Bible and archaeology, only a handful of cities actually attacked. And not many people lived in cities. They were for elite rulers, army, and administrative staff. Most people were farmers and lived next to the land that they tended and were not elite. Of course, when an enemy attacked, lots of people moved into the cities. Farmers suddenly became soldiers, and perhaps their families did too. Or if they were sensible, they ran away and hid until the fighting was over. Now, if you attacked a city and defeated it, what would you do? A normal army would rape, pillage, and kill. It still happens today sometimes. The law of Moses didn't allow soldiers to take part in rape or pillage. Israel was not allowed to rape, though they could rescue and marry girls. If they took a girl, they weren't allowed to sleep with her for a month. Deuteronomy 21:11 through 13. If you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. Israel wasn't allowed to pillage. They had to destroy everything of value. Livestock and clothing were burned, and indestructible metals given to the Lord. Most people went to war in order to steal stuff. Israel wasn't allowed to. The only motive left in the law of Moses for warfare was self-defense. Some cities did call their farmers in and create an army to attack Israel. When that happened, the law of Moses said they had to be brutal. When they won, they had to kill everyone. They had no choice. When a modern war ends, the victors destroy the enemy tanks and planes, just like how the Americans bombed Saddam Hussein's army retreating from Kuwait. They had to do the same, otherwise the same tanks would be back next year again. The ancient arsenals of war weren't tanks and planes, but people. The ancient codes of revenge meant that even children had to be killed, because family members were honor-bound to get revenge in the future. A modern army is always sent out with rules of engagement. For peacekeeping, they may shoot only if they are shot at. In some warfare, they must avoid civilian casualties at almost all costs. In others, civilians are legitimate targets because they harbor the enemy. Joshua read out the rules of engagement to the people outside Jericho. Joshua 6:17. The city shall be under the ban. It and all that is in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, so that you do not covet them and take some of the things under the ban and make the camp of Israel accursed and bring trouble on it. But all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord. He is applying the general rules of engagement given to by God in Deuteronomy 20:16. If they attack an enemy town within Palestine, they destroy it completely. They kill every person and animal and burn everything flammable. The indestructible gold, silver, and bronze are donated to the tabernacle. This is what is called the ban or devotion, translations of Heron. I think any modern reader should be horrified by these rules of engagement. If not, I'd say they'd seen too many bloodthirsty movies at an early age. In modern warfare, it is a general rule to avoid civilian casualties, and soldiers who surrender or are captured are not executed. There have been some very serious exceptions to this, of course, especially World War II, when the British invented civilian bombing, and when the Americans ended the war by atom bombing civilians, and Vietnam, when the enemy were indistinguishable from civilians. But generally, it is considered a war crime to deliberately target civilians. Actually, we read two sets of rules of engagement in Deuteronomy 20. Utter destruction and death is reserved only for cities within Palestine. Cities outside Palestine should be dealt with much more kindly, verses 10 through 15. Anyone who surrenders must not be killed, but they are put to forced labor. And only the males who fight should be put to death when they're defeated. This still sounds very rough by modern standards, but it is remarkably lenient. There are even merciful rules of engagement for the trees of the enemy. Verse 19, they needed wood for fuel and making siege engines, and this was allowed. But they were not allowed to cut down any trees unnecessarily, and they were forbidden to cut down any fruit trees for any purpose. For the ultimate reason is that the trees were not humans, so they weren't dangerous. The point is that they were only to do as much violence as necessary. They killed only men who were actually soldiers who attacked them. If they surrendered, they let them live, though kept an eye on them as servants. But within Palestine, the situation was more serious because they were closer. If they left any man or even any woman or children, they would fight again. They would become an enemy within, so they couldn't afford to leave them alive. They couldn't afford to have 24-hour guards or build a wall like modern Israel. Other nations at this time normally killed all males who surrender, or at least maim them so they couldn't turn around and fight you again. For example, in 1 Samuel 11:2, a city tries to surrender to the Ammonites and are told, "We accept, but we will gouge out the right eye of every male." But Israel was known to be different, so in 1 Kings 20:30, the advisors of the king Aram is told, "Let's surrender, the kings of Israel are merciful." The total destruction of livestock and property was unique in the Old Testament world, because looting enemy goods was the main reason for being a soldier. Julius Caesar was the first to pay wages to soldiers, because previously they had always paid themselves by plundering the enemy's wealth. So if you wanted to keep soldiers loyal, you regularly went to find enemies. But God said that all plunder had to be destroyed and indestructible metals had to be given to the tabernacle. So the only motive you had for going to war was self-defense.
Question. I'm saying that the only motive was self-defense.
Yeah.
That when they came out of the 40 years, they took the land.
Right.
But it wasn't a self-defense.
It's really not self-defense.
No.
I think how I interpret that is not the only motive was self-defense, but the motive was no longer acquiring the enemy's wealth. You know, that's how I don't understand that self-defense thing either, because but previously you could see being a soldier, you were trying to acquire the wealth of whoever.
You were trying to make enemies.
Yeah, and you tried, like you'd love going to war because it meant that you were getting some loot, basically, and looting. The law of Moses was completely uncompromising about religion. The Israelites had to go out of their way to destroy altars and high places. They had to destroy their whole nations and wipe out whole peoples. They didn't do this by killing all the people, but by destroying their religion. Why? It sounds like cultural genocide. Numbers 33:51-53. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you pass over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their metal images, and demolish all their high places. And you shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it. We can feel morally offended about this because it sounds like racism, but the new Jewish nation wasn't interested in racial purity. When they left Egypt, there was a mixed multitude with them. Moses married a Midianite and then a Cushite. Canaanites like Rahab became part of Israel's highest family. Judaism was a uniting religion with tribes based on an ancient family, but they didn't have a common ancestry any more than the British or Americans. We start to understand when we find out more about these religions. They weren't all equally bad, and to be honest, we don't know much about them. But the little we do know is horrific enough to justify wiping them out. True devotion to these gods was shown by child sacrifices. We don't know much about this because it was comprehensively destroyed, but the practices survived at times of crisis, such as 2 Kings 3:27, when the king of Moab resorted to sacrificing his firstborn son when facing defeat in war. But in earlier religions, child sacrifice of the firstborn was normal for everyone. The most famous is Moloch, whose huge metal statues had outstretched hands. Under each statue was a hollow belly in which a fire was lit to roast the baby offering. Baby sacrifices were offered to this horrendous god in places called a Tophet. There are a few archaeological remains in Israel where they were stamped out, but the Phoenicians continued the practice at their outpost in Carthage. If you go on a tourist holiday in Tunisia, go into the Sosé Museum. I remember my utter shock and distress when I wandered into a dull-looking room and I realized what it was, the remains of a well-preserved Tophet. There are lots of stone tablets that they look like small tombstones, each representing someone's baby sacrificed to placate the gods. Buried under each stone, they found the baby or child's bones, sometimes burned. Modern Tunisian archaeologists explain all of them together as a baby's graveyard. But why weren't they buried in the family burial plots? Because they now belong to the horrible gods who demanded their sacrifice. I suspect that this horrific practice was much more common than we think. A very common find is the little model goddesses, but they are usually broken. They're broken in the middle at the fattest part, so it isn't accidental breakage. And often the break is daubed with red paint, but no one knows why. The many faces of the goddess, that's just a reference. Let's see. I wonder if these so-called fertility goddesses of old are actually sacrifice tokens. When the firstborn is killed, the fertile figure is broken at the womb, and the pieces are kept as a token of the sacrifice that they made to her. In our modern world, we have a commendable attitude of religious tolerance, but some things we cannot tolerate. The Spanish invaders stamped out human sacrifice of the Mayans. The Baptist missionary William Carey successfully campaigned against sati, the Hindu practice of throwing a widow onto the funeral pyre of her husband. Christianity wiped out the last cannibalism from Papua New Guinea, while at the same time defending the rights of Jews, Hindus, and Muslims to worship as they liked, even when living in overwhelmingly Christian countries. Joshua's army made a start at ridding the world of human sacrifice, and fortunately, that kind of worship is now almost completely gone. There are still some occult groups in Congo and elsewhere who do this. So was Israel asked to commit cultural genocide? Yes. Did this involve killing everyone? No. They weren't asked to and didn't. They killed any soldiers who attacked them and any families who lived nearby, but those who weren't living nearby were spared. They only killed as necessary. Their laws forbade rape or pillage, so they only went to war in self-defense. Is this a monstrous law? I wish the nations today would follow this law.
But didn't they say, like, in that, the march coming out of the 40 years, I thought it said in there that you were supposed to kill men, women, children, everything.
Yeah, I think that's what he's talking about. So that they shifted from,
After that.
and it's kind of interpretation of what they actually did.
That was in, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was in Jericho that they,
I thought it was even after.
They
that. No, I
took-
could be wrong on that one.
and it was military post, and then in the area that's not, and I wish Karen were here, she could do a better job of it, but in modern day Palestine, the areas that were very, very close to them, and the ones that there were certain areas that they were called to take, but I think that's why he did the reference later on of their sacrifices and their culture and like exactly what it was that they were wiping out. The ones that they weren't, and forced to is probably the wrong words, but logistically forced to by, they're going to be here and there's these people right around me that are doing these things. The ones that were further off, the ones that, in other words, that they could go to war with and then leave and it wasn't as much of a danger, those they didn't. And and there's the next one that we'll look at next week also goes into this as well as the specifics of the law, but it gets into some of the specific wording, kind of like with Noah and the beginning, the Genesis and things like that, where there's certain words where we read and it sounds like it means everyone, but in reality it didn't necessarily, and that's, I believe, why he referenced later on where he was talking about don't marry them. And so he's saying his point is it wouldn't have said don't marry them if this meant our
They
common
actually were gonna kill
interpretation of everyone. So yes, at the military posts and yes, at the specific places where they were wiping out, but for the most part, no. It's the way that I understand. But like I said, correct me if I'm wrong or if y'all interpret differently.
And I think that's what he's saying is later on, even though they might have used the same words, they're really attacking a military base, a military installation. So it's not this city with a bunch of parks with a bunch of kids running around.
Right.
It really is just the military base or the military installation.
That makes sense.
So even though they say kill everybody, they're saying, well, kill everybody on that military base, not kill everybody in all of Lubbock.
You explained that better than I did.
But it's hard because the words don't change,
I
but
use
it's
too
kind
many
of
words.
interpretation, and it's kind of like the Bible story or the Noah story where we could think of it in two different ways.
Well, and again, you always have to realize that in the translations, you know that coming from Hebrew and the Greek Greek translations were changing some
It'll
words.
change. It'll change, and there is some room
There
for
are
interpretation.
There are some words that we just don't have words
Yeah.
for in English.
And you come back to that thing about don't marry the women, and so if you kill everybody, you don't have to then say don't marry the women. So they say basically kill all the military, and then they're like, oh, by the way, you've got these special rules about what to do with the women that are left over, stuff like that.
We all need special rules about what to do with women.
Indeed.
I think y'all are outnumbered in here. I mean,
Because we don't listen. That's another lesson.
All right, discussion questions. Compare the Old Testament laws regarding wartime and prisoner treatment. In what general direction have things changed? Are wartime laws more lenient or more strict?
Well, it depends upon, the thing is that many of the laws that we have in place, the Geneva Convention and all, there are many countries who, ISIS, for example, who don't follow those laws. They don't
right.
care about the laws.
Right.
You know, and I mean, so as far as warfare, like with ISIS is concerned,
They're not going to follow.
they're worse than even what they're saying here.
Right.
When you look at a lot of that, the Geneva Convention stuff, if you look at like the history of the human race, it's pretty recent, you know?
Yeah.
Very, very recent.
Look at
Oh, yeah.
the examples of War II, where it's just carpet bombing.
Yeah. We're talking the last 100 years. This is all these
Yeah.
rules have come about. We've been warring for thousands and thousands of years.
Yep.
Yeah. But overall, I think it's more lenient, assuming people follow the rules. But that's what I've never understood is you're going to say, well, we're going to go take over this country, and we're going to bring guns and bombs and missiles and things that destroy with us, and then we're going to follow these rules about don't be humane. One of the least humane things you can do to somebody is kill them. So, the Geneva Convention is about maiming and suffering, not necessarily death,
The
but
pillaging
suffering.
part.
Yeah. So, but it's never made sense to me because you're going to do an aggressive thing, and you're saying, well, we won't be terribly aggressive about it.
We'll
So
kill
it
you
doesn't-
fast.
Yeah, we'll kill you humanely. I don't know.
Yeah.
It doesn't. I don't know. It's never made a whole lot of sense to me. You can see why it was brought about though, because in a long time ago it was just barbaric. Like there was really, a lot of suffering involved in the process.
Part of the problem is, and I have never been in war, but we have a real fantasy version of what most people have a very fantasy version about what they really think war
Of what
is.
war is, right?
Yeah, and when
But
it
there really is a
gets-
lot of
there is-
suffering. There really
It's
is.
all barbaric.
Yeah.
I mean, it can't not be.
Right. And that's my point is the minute you decide to go to war, you're going to create suffering. Because even if you kill the person, what about the family? You just made the family suffer for that person's death, and it's hard to then apply these rules of conduct and stuff like that say, oh well, it's going to be nicer. Well, it's not going to be that much nicer.
The hippies had it all right. We just need to sit around a big campfire and sing Kumbaya.
Yeah.
And nothing will get done.
Number 2, consider prisoners of war. How were they treated in the Old Testament times? Were there any prisoners, or were they killed? If they were taken prisoner, how were they treated? And I think back in those times, I think it was much more barbaric. They were
They were
probably
killed.
not fed, and but like they said, they didn't even have the capability to jail these people. They didn't have the capability of making a wall that would hold people. So they basically said, well, we can't contain them, so just kill them. Right.
Sometimes that might be better than
Than
torture that's
the
going
torture.
on.
Yeah.
And some of the other.
And again, there's rules. The Geneva Convention. There's rules for treatment of prisoners of war. That's But again, they have to follow it. They have to
Follow
follow
the
it.
rules.
Right.
That only applies.
Right. And you're right. The most recent threats we see are not going to be people who are following these rules.
Not even close.
Absolutely. In times of war, would you rather be a man, woman, or child? How were you treated differently in each of these cases?
In old war, you're talking about in the old times?
It's all
Oh,
bad.
we can approach each separately, I guess.
I would still rather be a man.
Really? Because you'll just end up dead?
I would
And
Quick.
I would rather be a man than just be dead.
Yeah.
I think I'd rather be a man because I would be part of the war mechanism. I'd be part of the military mechanism, and I'd have some fighting chance.
Right.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I guess I always thought that it was pretty much like they went out and wiped everyone out. So
Yeah.
in that particular case,
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
You'd rather be a child because you wouldn't even know what hit you, I guess. But the hard part, I think, about being a soldier is feeling this need to protect your family, but also your need to do the military, the soldier part of it, which they're not the same thing, you know. And in the United States, the soldier goes away and then, you know, comes back if they're lucky, and not if they're not lucky. But their family was in the town where they were getting attacked, so you would probably have to decide: am I going to be a soldier, or am I going to try to evacuate or protect my family? Which wasn't really the same thing as being the soldier, because you really weren't following orders if you stayed with your family. They probably said, "You come fight over here," but then you have to abandon your family. And
I'm sure it brings all different rules when you're at war on your home turf. I mean, that's entirely different, just altogether.
yeah,
Oh,
Red Dawn.
Right.
Red Dawn.
But that on that particular movie, that would be what I would like. Doing the low key, below the radar kind of fighting. You know,
yeah.
not the British front line.
Right, the Civil War, line up in a row, and the first
You're gonna
couple
be
rows are
hiding-
just
hiding
going to
and
die
shooting,
immediately.
You're not going to see me. That's the way I want to do it.
Right. It was, that's
And you also have to realize that of the PTSD type of aspects
Suffering,
after
suffering.
this.
yeah,
I mean, when you start thinking back after it's all said and done, and you start thinking back about what you did
Mhm.
and why you did it, and the
and
morality,
feeling guilt or not.
the self-reflection on
Right.
that
Right,
is involved too.
right. Because just because you come back does not mean you're not
Tainted.
damaged. And yeah. Consider what you know of radical Islam, ISIS, and Al Qaeda. What laws do you think they have regarding prisoners of war?
We've already
Say
covered
none.
that.
What have they shown regarding their view of morality? But it's interesting because from their perspective, they're following their religious text, and their religious text, to the best of my understanding, their religious text says, kill anybody that's does not believe and read the Quran.
And
believe our
in their
religion.
God.
Yeah.
You know, the thing that has always bothered me about this is that their God is the same God as our God. Their God is
It's
the
supposed
God
to
of
be.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the same God.
Yeah,
You know, and I've never really quite understood that.
yeah. You know, maybe part of our exploration should be, let's look into the history of the Quran and where that came from.
Because we had a
How did it go from
It's
just,
not just a translation of the Bible, for
Well,
sure, you know.
instead of trying to convert them just to kill everyone?
Right.
well, but you also have to realize that as Christians, we did this too. You know, during the Crusades, this is exactly what we did. You either convert to what we are, or we're going to kill you.
right now.
And that's the exact same thing that they're doing now.
Yeah.
We've done it. So we're not exempt from this.
But the only
what's
thing is,
interesting
But it's changed.
is
when you look
the
at,
reason.
I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
know, I'm interrupting.
I was just gonna say, the only thing is, if you look at that period of time though, that was when the Bible was
That's what I was
getting
gonna
really
say.
corrupted with,
Mhm.
you know, it had to be the
Yeah.
Latin version.
And they were destroying versions they didn't like.
Right.
Right, so that one had like some ulterior motives. It was, I wouldn't blame
Right.
Christianity for that. I'd more blame, you know, a lot of the corruption of the church.
And
Well,
corruption
but
of
at
some
the
of the
same-
translations.
But at the same
Yeah.
time, I'm
Picking
not
and
sure that
choosing.
I'm going to blame Muslims for what's going on with ISIS. I'm
Yeah.
going to blame a corruption of.
Right.
Same
Could be.
type
Right,
thing,
right.
you know.
There's a lot of generalizations that go
Right.
on.
It's a parallel, which is interesting because if you talk to, and I haven't read the Quran, so maybe I'm speaking wrong, but I have been friends with Muslims who say that the Quran itself doesn't say anything about that,
Yeah.
and that it doesn't promote killing or things like that. And I've also, because I'm really evangelical, I mean, I've given them Bibles and we've talked about Jesus and we've talked about all these different things. And you're right, the word Allah means, is their word for God. I mean, it literally translates God. That's just a translation. Where they missed the mark, or missed maybe that's the wrong word to use, but what they missed, the piece, is Jesus in his role,
He's
which
the
is,
New
of course,
Testament.
the cornerstone. I mean, that's the big one. But as far as, it's interesting to parallel, because you're right, the Latin Vulgate, it was corrupted, it was changed by the Catholic Church, and of course later on they went back to earlier versions and fixed it and got it right. But I think it's the exact same thing with this. Like, they've taken the Quran and they've just, said that it says things that it doesn't.
In the study of the comparison, and I don't know, I haven't actually read this, but I've watched some different videos on it. This one teacher was saying that actually Jesus' name is mentioned like 3 times more than Muhammad's name. Mary is the only woman in the Quran that's listed by name, and there's a chapter named after her. A few strange little things about
So Jesus is in the Quran.
Yes.
They do
But
Yes.
they certainly,
Jesus.
Yeah,
but
they
they certainly
believe
don't
in
go
Jesus.
down the forgiveness
And they believe in
pathway.
his divine birth.
Right.
But
But
many of
they
the
but they
prophets-
don't they believe in him as a prophet.
Right.
Not as
Even
the Son of
Muhammad
God.
is the final.
As the ultimate prophet.
Yeah.
You know, the thing is you can do anything you want to in the name of anybody you want
That's
to.
true.
And corrupt.
Anything.
Right. And I think there's something to be said for the fact that, if you are of the Islamic faith and people say that ISIS is radical Islam, you would not want to agree with that. You'd say, no, that's not Islam. That's a gross misinterpretation of Islam. Because if somebody went on a shooting rampage in a mall in America and claimed that it was for Jesus Christ, we wouldn't say, oh, well, yeah, that's
Right,
part of our
Christian.
religion. We'd
Right.
say, no, that guy was nuts, and he happened to mention Jesus
Yeah.
Christ, but that's not anything, that's not our religion.
Right.
And so I think some people that are Muslims and Islamic faith, they say, well, ISIS is not Islam, and ISIS is not being a Muslim. It's a complete different thing. And so I think that's, lately people have gotten on that. They don't want to even say that this is radical Islam, because
Well,
that would be saying like the crazy guy was just radical Christianity. That's not really true. That's not Christianity at all.
Well, it's kind of like if we remember back to that, in 9/11.
Yeah.
Pretty much everyone was like, "Oh, you're stereotyping because if you look like you're from these countries, we're
Right.
just not going to let you on the planes and stuff."
Exactly.
But there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
Yeah.
a lot of sterilization or generalizations that happen.
Yeah,
So.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and it's all over. I've got several friends that are Muslim, and you watch what what your friends are posting on Facebook and things like that. You're like, I'm friends with these people. They just don't. They don't get it. They don't understand anything about the religion, and I think it's a big problem in
Yeah.
us as Christians going around, trying to combine ISIS with Muslim and
Right.
and saying it like not necessarily in the name of Christianity, but representing yourself as a Christian, and then blatantly exposing your ignorance of the other religions.
Right.
I think the key word there is ignorance.
Yeah.
I think humans by nature,
Yeah.
if you don't know, you make generalizations.
Yeah.
And like, for instance, computers. If you don't know what's going on, everyone's like, oh, let's just reboot it, and it's something, just fix
Unplug
it.
it and
Yeah,
plug it back in.
exactly. So, there's that,
Yeah.
which I think is ignorance. You don't know what the root cause is, so you just
Mhm.
knee-jerk reaction, go back to what you think might fix.
Mhm.
And that's why I think it'd be awesome if we did cover the
That would
Go
be a
through
good
some of that.
study. That would be
Because my real question is, where does Al Qaeda and ISIS and where does this stuff come from? Like, it's obviously somewhat frustration with things, but if it's a true misrepresentation of the Quran and the religion, why are they going out on this violent?
I know where it
limb?
originally came from. It originally came from Ishmael, and he's a wild ass of a child.
Mhm.
And he's going to be at odds with everybody always.
Yeah. But we've approached some of the things that are taken, people say, well, in the Quran it says an eye for an eye. But we actually approached that because when they said cut off the arm, we talked about how those aren't literal things. Those aren't literal. Those are lessons to be learned. And for Jesus to say, Well, it would be better to cut off your arm than to let your arm continue to lead you down the path of sin. But we use that as, well, eye for an eye. Well, they're violent people. And then you start going down these pathways of ignorance and stuff like that.
I think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I really think it's just literally a mechanism for control that has absolutely nothing to do with religion. Kind of like the Catholic Church used the Latin Vulgate and the fact that nobody spoke Latin, and they said that it said 10 bajillion things. And granted, I mean, I say that saying, and y'all know this, but I was raised Catholic. I respect the Catholic Church now as it is, but back then it was just a mechanism for control, and I think it's the exact same thing. I think that it has nothing to do with religion. It has everything to do with control and power.
Right.
Is what I think. But
And just like I think the ISIS threat is really not a religion anymore, it's kind of a gang and an organization where people are paid and people get to do things they want to do, and
Right.
they get to commit acts that are otherwise frowned upon, and they get away with it. And
All in the
it's
name
it's
of-
not it's
Of religion,
I would
right.
I would have a hard time calling it a religion unless you call atheism is also a religion.
I like that, it's a game.
It's a gang. I mean, that's basically what it is,
Yeah.
because you really see a parallel with a gang, the way a gang operates in a city versus ISIS. They're recruiting people. They're saying, well, we're gonna take care of you. You can be part of our club. We will take care of you financially. We'll take care of you. You'll be a tough guy, and it's very similar. So I think that's how we should consider it, is as a gang. The religious aspect, I think that's a cop-out to call it a
Well, I
religious
think-
organization. I
I
don't
think
think,
Window dressing.
yeah, it's window dressing.
I think a lot of it though is trying to gain support against them.
Yeah,
Kind of put that on the
yeah.
So,
And
what
I-
did I say?
The KKK has done all these atrocities forever and
Oh,
forever
that's
in the
true.
name of Christianity or whatever.
Right.
Mhm.
And we never
You know,
called it a
And
religion.
it's kind of,
It's a game too.
It's a
Yeah.
game too.
Right.
Right.
yeah, it's kind of the same.
Right, right.
No,
It is. And it's a gang, and once you're in the gang, then they have this propaganda that keeps you, kind of fuels your fire, and then they send you out to do things on behalf of their organization.
Well, I think too, when people start, and I think they use this for a matter of manipulation, but I think when people start saying, this is part of my religion, then people automatically, they're like taking it, well, I can't offend, I've got to, show some degree of tolerance or whatever you want to call it for that. And so it's almost like this shroud that they put upon themselves to protect themselves, but it's not,
Right.
it's just kind of a false, yeah, the word doesn't come to me. That happens when you get old. It just goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, to call it a religion, I think is really, that's really not what it is. And it's, because you talk to people who are Islamic and Muslim, and they're like, well, it's not us. I mean, it's not anything to do with what we do. So what is it? It's an extreme form of something, but I don't think the religious aspect is. I think, like you said, it's just used for protection. So it's interesting. Imagine if Jesus were in the world today. We always consider what would Jesus do in our circumstances, but what would Jesus think of political battles and terrorism, racism, gang violence, mainstream media?
Which, by the way, church is starting, so we can either answer really quick or come back to, or. Oh,
Well,
okay,
we've
fine.
kind of talked
Real quick.
about all of that,
Yeah.
and that really a lot of this is the terrorism, the racism, it's gangs. It's a gang mentality.
Right.
And I think he would think of it as that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I do think like what Ryan preached. I don't know, it was like a month ago or something. The truth and tolerance. Or grace and what was
Truth.
it?
Grace and truth.
Grace and yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there needs to be a balance, and I think America, the pendulum is swinging so far over to one side where, you got to be walking on eggshells all the time and everything.
You can't
else.
say anything about anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if we defend our faith, someone will accuse
Someone's
us
going to be
of intolerance.
Yeah. Someone's going to be offended,
Yeah.
and we can't offend people.
Right, right.
As I've gotten older, I get more to the point where it's like tough. I really don't care.
Yeah.
If I offend you, I'm sorry, and that wasn't my objective, but
Right, right.
this is how I believe,
Right.
Well, it's like when
whether
Ryan
you like it or not.
told us to stand up and point north, And he's like, okay, I'm sorry, but this is the way that North is.
Well,
And it's kind of like that. I mean, yeah, you may offend someone, but we can't all be right if we're saying opposing views. I mean,
Right.
it's not logistically possible. And so,
Especially if it's something that's factually.
right, exactly.
You can factually figure out.
It's one way or the other. It's Josh McDowell does a neat illustration of, he says, man and woman are walking down the street and she says that she's pregnant. And he says that she's not. Well, in 9 months you're going to figure out who's right and who's wrong. And it's the same thing with religions, but there's this mentality that, all roads lead to the same place and they're all right. Well, they contradict each other on some very, very key issues, fundamental things. And that doesn't mean that you can't love and respect other people, but it also means
But that's the
say
key.
two different things.
That's the
They
key.
do.
Just because I don't agree with what
Right.
you say doesn't mean that I can't love you.
Right, exactly. And treat you with respect.
Treat you with respect and be
Right.
nice.
I think Jesus would condemn all of those things, but if he had to budget, his strength, he would first priority on condemning the mainstream media.
Because they
Because it
misreport things.
proliferates a lot.
pour gasoline on all these
Yeah,
cars.
they bias their reporting, they omit facts, and I think if Jesus had to budget his energy, he would put first priority on condemning the mainstream media.
That's one of the big reasons I like listening to BBC. Is you get a whole different perspective
Yeah.
on everything, even when they report
Right.
American media.
And it's not
They
just
have a real
not just left wing, right wing. It's
Right,
just completely out of
it's
it.
really
out of all
different,
of it.
but it gives me a good view of.
And it's more worldwide view, not
It is.
U.S. view.
And I'm kind of on that subject. I work with a bunch of doctors from probably 10 different countries. And it amazes me. They know what's going on in our country. They know what's going on in West Africa. They know what's going on in the Middle East. They know what's going on in China. They know what's going on in England. I mean, they don't just know what's going on here and in their home country. It just surprises me that we
Ignore.
we were
ignore.
what happened on that wreck down the street, but we're
Right.
ignoring what's going on in like
But we couldn't tell you what happened in any other country today.
China,
protests
yeah.
in China. We have no clue what's
Well, it's
going
kind of like the whole Brian Williams thing. That's put a spin on there to get ratings.
Well,
We gotta get the
don't talk
viewers.
ratings. I say take advertising out of the news and see
Mhm.
don't get really boring. You gotta think about it.
But I think it's about time.
I think, Jesus would condemn, well, not condemn, but he would, tongue lash, people, both on the far left and the far right.
Yeah.
He would tongue lash.
But for the deception, it's for the deception they're trying to push people into their group.
Right, like Mark Levine, Mark Levine who yells and screams all the time, and that's on the far right. But on the far left, you have people like Keith Overbite, on MSNBC, he would get a tongue lashing too, because both of them, paranoid. They're both alarmists. They're paranoid.
Okay, let's pray real quick and head out of here if that works. God, we thank you that you love us, and we thank you that you forgive us for the ways that we fall short. Help us to focus on ourselves, Lord. Help us to focus on living the lives that you called us to live, God, and to be the people that you call us to be, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay.